it is fitting that the first bill to come before this first joint sitting of the Australian Parliament should be designed to strengthen the quality of popular democracy in Australia.
The change in the law is that they won't be able to go 20% above or 20% below, but only to 10%. That's the first provision, and that is political dynamite. It is the basis upon which a gerrymander can be built by the Labor Party, and that's why we oppose it.
What is just as significant is that it will ensure a greater frequency of redistributions, and that is long overdue.
For those people who haven't taken a great interest in this electoral matter must now become highly suspicious of the government, which has become preoccupied with electoral matters.
That they don't have a divine right to govern, but they have to earn it. They might return to this side, your side, this side, Mr. Chairman, a lot more swiftly than they will at the moment, because the speeches that have been given here today will not stand the analysis of any secondary school child in Australia.
Why should the people of the Northern Territory and of the Australian Capital Territory be denied representation in both houses of the Parliament?
Good afternoon, everybody. And this is a slightly changed format because this is not a paper with respondents, but rather a discussion about one of the significant aspects of those reforms that were initiated by virtue of the double dissolution and the joint sitting. And as you can see, the subject is the democratisation of the Australian landscape. I'm Kim Rubenstein, and you'll see on the program that I'm joined by eminent legal, political and constitutional scholars. So a great collection to really range over a discussion about the nature of electoral reform, how electoral reform fits within our constitutional framework. And these are all areas that I have been interested in and passionate about throughout my own scholarship on citizenship and on gender and constitutional law. And before we just do launch into it, thanks to the outcome of that Senate representation bill, the following election, we did see Susan Ryan elected as a senator for the ACT. And as was mentioned earlier, the wonderful statue of Susan was unveiled just within the last week. And I would encourage all of you, beyond seeing the wonderful statues of Enid Lyons and Dorothy Tagney walking together into the Parliament in 1943, we now have a full-life, authentic statue, if that's the way, because many women's statues are not representative of women as they are, but a representation of Susan in her crossover dress, which was the first time a parliamentarian had worn such a dress, outside in the Rose Garden. So I'd encourage you all to see that, and it does link very nicely to this session on representation. But we are going to begin with Graeme Orr just giving us a little bit of an overview of the package and what it represented in terms of electoral democracy.
Thanks, Kim. Well, first and foremost, electoral reform was a multi-decade prepossession of the Labor Party, Fred Daly, and above all, Mr Whitlam. In his tome, The Whitlam Government, Gough Whitlam writes that one of his longest chapters is on electoral reform, which in a sense is a very narrow approach to democracy. And he says, no issue of administration or general law was more pressing for my government. And for Mr Whitlam, it was principled, but it also seems to be personal. As a young member of the House for the seat of Werriwa, then on the right edge of Sydney, he had a very fast-growing electorate with a very large population of new migrants and of children. Both tend to be non-voters but needing representation. So one vote, one value. For burgeoning suburbs, not extra seats for agriculture and mining areas mattered deeply. The sweep of electoral reform, as we noted at the start of today, began at the end of 1972. One of the first bills was 18-year-old voting franchise down from 21 years. So that's a question of being more inclusive. Then who was represented? We'll talk in a moment about territory, not just members of the House, but territory senators. And then above all, what a majority might mean, in particular pushing towards one vote, one value. It's interesting that the opposition were happy to have new members of the House from the territories, but not senators. And their arguments were about original federalism. But it all seems strange if you're thinking of federalism as to represent regions to oppose the ACT and the Northern Territory having a couple of senators. And then after the joint sitting, the successful joint sitting, in late 1974, Mr Daly and Mr Whitlam tried to get up optional preferential voting, party names on ballots to make voting easier, and election spending limits, perhaps partly having been stung by the $1 million that the AMA and the Freedom Fund had spent in the election against Medibank. They were blocked in that by the Senate. Now, of course, Labor now dislikes optional preferential voting, but Mr Whitlam at the time said, and most academics agree, that optional preferential voting is the one system that gives you the ability to express apathy about candidates and not just for or against. And we're still waiting for spending limits, I notice, in the Commonwealth level. Now, for one vote, one value, just quickly, there's an issue of context. The broader context, which Marian might get into, is that we had some really serious malapportionments in the bigger states, particularly Queensland and Western Australia at the time. Besides context, there were other concerted efforts going on. We've heard about the 1974 referendum, which was relatively narrowly lost, sort of Brexit-style margin, 52-48. And it had sought to mandate pure one vote, one value, based on population, not electors. And one reason it lost is it was going to impose it on the states as well as the Commonwealth. Then in 1975, there was a case where the High Court rejected plaintiffs who sought to argue, in line with then US law, that one vote, one value, pure one vote, one value, should be implied into the Constitution. And only new boy Justice Lionel Murphy accepted the American-style arguments, whereas Chief Justice Barwick said one vote, one value is a political slogan, a mere catch cry, not something that the Constitution is underpinned by, and fair enough given that Tasmania's guaranteed 5 members of the House in the Constitution. Finally, context, other concerted efforts, there's also long-term consequences. So this idea of pushing towards one vote, one value by reducing the margin or tolerance around the average size of an electorate down to plus or minus 10%, well, the Electoral Act still has that in it today. The only real change is that technology and population statistics are now so good that the Electoral Commission can actually aim for a much narrower tolerance of plus or minus 3.5%. The second consequence is that the state parliaments eventually fell into line, worked themselves pure, which I guess Chief Justice Barwick could say, well, that's what parliamentary sovereignty is for. But ultimately, the idea of one vote, one value has prevailed in Australia as an urban society against the older idea of Australia as being made up of the bush.
I'll just follow up on what you said about Susan Ryan and how this joint sitting led to her election as ACT Senator, because earlier this year it was the 40th anniversary of the passage of the Sex Discrimination Act, which was such a great achievement for Susan Ryan and such a turning point for Australian women. So just to mention that. But as you say, and as we've just seen Gough Whitlam saying, it was fitting that the Commonwealth Electoral Bill number 2 should be the first bill considered and debated and passed at the joint sitting. Whitlam believed that instituting fair elections, as he saw it, was essential if Labor Party was to deliver on its mandate. Malapportionment had been a constant theme for Whitlam since 1955, both as a matter of principle and because of his belief that Labor lost elections, including the federal elections of 1954, 1961 and 1969, because of malapportionment. Whitlam followed closely the US Supreme Court decisions in the 1960s in favour of the one vote, one value principle, but also the presence of that principle in UN human rights instruments. Almost as soon as the Whitlam government was elected, Australia signed the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, without reservations, as Whitlam said proudly. That happened on the 18th of December, the last day of the Whitlam-Barnard duumvirate. Article 25 of the ICCPR provided for elections by universal and equal suffrage and held by secret ballot. Australia's great contribution had been the invention of a practical form of the secret ballot, but it had done much less to progress equal suffrage, meaning one vote, one value. While the Australian Constitution prohibited plural votes, it said nothing about equal value. There was a very long history of weighting of votes in favour of rural areas in Australia, described by Graeme in his wonderful textbook on the law of politics as egregious malapportionment and rural weighting. Such malapportionment reflected the influence of agrarian ideology in Australia, described by Don Aitken as country-mindedness. And I've got a good description of that somewhere. People in rural areas were a small minority in population terms, but with a central role in the national economy, and their voice was likely to be significantly outweighed by the interests of urban voters who have no understanding of or sympathy with the concerns of rural voters. So a little bit of rural populism there, not quite to the extent of today. We don't hear about the contempt of inner city elites for rural interests, but you get the picture. The Commonwealth Electoral Bill number 2 proposed implementing the one vote, one value principle enshrined in Article 25 of the Covenant as equal suffrage by reducing the permissible deviation from the quota of electors for each division from 20% to 10%, as Graeme has said, and removing reference to the need for remoteness, distance or sparsity of population to be taken into account in redistributions. The words from Article 25 of the ICCPR were also incorporated in the 1973 Human Rights Bill, as Graeme has said. Well, there was, of course, enormous resistance to this bill when it was debated in 1973 and 1974, before the joint sitting. The Country Party was absolutely outraged by the suggestion that rural weighting would be lost, and threw everything at this, every argument under the sun, including the argument that the Labor Party had been very considerate of the needs of other minorities, but ignored completely the needs of rural minorities. But of course, there are other ways apart from rural weighting to ensure effective representation of large, sparsely populated rural areas. As Earl Warren said in the US Supreme Court, legislators represent people, not trees or acres. So better than rural or regional weighting is provision of additional resources to enable effective representation of these scattered populations, including extra electorate officers and staff. Today, 7 rural seats are allocated 3 electorate officers and 13 are allocated 2, so together with additional staff for these officers. So the passage of Commonwealth Electoral Bill number 2 at the joint sitting was enormously important in the gradual removal of malapportionment in Australia, a slow process which Graeme's already alluded to, and which continued till 2021 when Western Australia finally abolished malapportionment for its Legislative Council. But at the time, the joint sitting was not the end of the story by any means of one vote, one value, and nor is it all of the story. From at least 1955, Whitlam had called for electoral divisions to contain as nearly as practical the same number of people rather than the same number of voters, and for that to be enshrined in the Constitution. As Graeme has mentioned, in 1969, his electorate of Werra had 250,000 residents, but only 100,000 electors, the rest being children and migrants. His argument was that looking after the needs of children and migrants made up a large part of the work of representation. However, as Phil Green, former ACT Electoral Commissioner, has pointed out, if redistributions were on the basis of population, suburban electorates with a large proportion of non-citizens would have fewer enrolled electors than those in rural areas at the expense of the one vote, one value principle. So these ideas are in tension, the representation of population and the representation of electors. So to shift to a population base would amount to urban as contrasted with rural vote weighting. The democratic elections referendum held at the same time as the double dissolution was unsuccessful in seeking to make population the basis for redistributions. After the fall of the Whitlam government, the Fraser government reintroduced rural weighting through the 5,000 square kilometre rule. The Fraser government ratified the ICCPR, which I'm referring to the Covenant on International Civil and Political Rights, as in 1980, but with more and longer reservations than any other country, according to Gough Whitlam, including a reservation concerning Article 25, that the reservation ensured that regional interests could be taken into account through basically regional and rural vote weighting, and it also reserved the right to continue with property votes at the local government level. So those were the reservations entered by the Fraser government to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And that lasted until the Hawke government withdrew the reservation concerning Article 25 in November 1985 and abolished the 5,000 square kilometre rule, etc. So finally, Australia fully accedes to the principle of universal and equal suffrage as set out in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And as I've said, by 2021, all Australian jurisdictions had addressed the problem of malapportionment and rural weighting. Thank you.
Thanks, Marian. It's interesting reflecting on your references to the International Convention. Normally when you teach constitutional law, you look to the conventions to enable the Commonwealth to make laws under the external affairs power, whereas of course the Commonwealth clearly had capacity to make electoral reform without needing the convention. I don't know if you or Kristen or others want to comment on that desire to have that international element as part of the political campaign as opposed to a constitutional or legal one. It's sort of an interesting example, isn't it?
Well, I mean, as you know, Kim, Gough Whitlam, placed a lot of emphasis on Australia being in conformity with international human rights instruments, and this, in this case, his political commitment to getting rid of malapportionment totally coincided with a very important international human rights instrument. But you might...
No, I'll pass on that.
Kristen, I was wanting to extend a little bit more the discussion about the move to the legislation, and I wondered if you wanted to talk about some of the themes of that legislative approach.
Thanks, Kim. I've just ringing my ears of various things that Jenny and Josh and Frank spoke about in their longer papers. Something that I think is really significant about this era in this connection between electoral reform and representation and the legitimacy of government is, of course, the fact that the Whitlam era was an era in which governing was going to be done differently. People were going to be governed in a much more direct way. And one of the things that is striking about the rhetoric that's used in this era is the notion that the national polity was welcoming people to have relationships with government in an era, especially for people who had otherwise been marginalised, women being crucial here, where the opportunity to have a positive or constructive relationship with government had been so limited or indeed not on offer at all. And so that, I think, from the work I've done as an administrative lawyer and a legal theorist on this era, especially its administration, is that we saw a radical increase in the invitation to take up the offer of government power, but in a way that would benefit the individual. And I was talking about this with a colleague of mine the other day who, like me, is a baby of the early 1970s. And she was the single daughter of a single mother. And she grew up in a household where her mother had taken the newspaper article announcing the supportive mother's benefit that was going to be enacted, taken that and framed it, and her whole childhood, that was in a frame in their apartment because of the significance of that measure for someone to be able to raise her daughter on her own, which she directly contributed to the opportunities of this positive exercise of power that was opened up. But what's interesting, and it goes also to what we're hearing in the other sessions about this question of obstruction and what is this constitutional architecture for, or who is it for? The responses to that are fascinating politically, and Jenny spoke of that when she spoke of the sort of overdrawn contrast between free enterprise and socialism. But if you look at some of the work, or some of the Hansard discussions actually around the introduction of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, the new administrative law package, there's a really interesting contrast between, again, the Whitlam side speaking the language of relationships to government, while the opposition speaks of intrusions by government. Like, it was as stark as that in how these measures were being set up. So that was the first thing I wanted to address, was that being governed was going to happen differently in this era, and so the significance of representation and electoral reform can be tied to that, because these were the reforms that would lead to representation that would justify and legitimate new ways of being governed. But the second point I wanted to make about the legislative program itself, if anyone's interested, I had a research assistant literally put together the entire legislative program list for me. It comes to 478 pieces of legislation over the Whitlam era, and she hyperlinked each one to the second reading speeches and so forth, and it's fascinating so to see it all laid out in this way. But this was not just any kind of legislative ambush of a sort we've not seen before in Australia, but it was a legislative ambush of a very certain kind, which was to create more regimes of what I call regimes of authorisation. We were building institutions, we were giving them power to do things and make changes in the Australian landscape in a modern Australian way. And from a lawyer's point of view, this was a really significant incursion on how law was otherwise done in that point in Australia, which was that there was a much greater role for the common law, for judge-made law and its way of facilitating the possession and regulation of private rights in property and contract. The common law was suddenly in quite significant competition with a different way that we would produce law in this country, which was to democratic lawmaking, legislating. And we think about the advent of the federal court as a statutory jurisdiction, as a recognition that we in Australia, as a nation, as a federal nation with a complex set of circumstances, was going to, under the Whitlam government especially, push for a democratic mode of lawyering and lawmaking that, to a large extent, we have not fully retreated from, although we've allowed private law and common law in different ways. But it was more than an adaptation of English inheritances here. This was a direct contest or conflict with the inherited political and legal traditions of the common law, which are far more oriented to private right than to public right. So From an administrative lawyer's point of view, there's really interesting things to observe in the nexus between electoral reform and the kind of lawmaking that we then turn towards, as well as the kind of governing relationships that were fostered with individuals in the Australian polity, particularly groups who had otherwise been marginalised to that point, to bring them into the polity through a relationship with government that was facilitated primarily through administrative power.
So I would characterise that as an enabling of an active citizenship.
Using the very thing that the Conservative opposition saw as an intrusion on the individual was actually a positive enabling of membership and participation in the polity. So it's that English common law inheritance that stands behind the notion of intrusion. And I think we can sometimes lose sight of the quite complex mix we have as a legal system in Australia politically between those two competing ways of doing lawyering and being part of the polity.
Which is a lovely segue to looking more at the politics of it. Actually, Anika, I was going to go or to Graeme next. Or no, I think Anika, were you going to... Yes. Oh, so you have a point to make, sorry.
Federalists, though, I guess Federalists would say, well, being governed by who? And so this is where, as mentioned earlier, big battle really is happening at states, and the Conservative parties being states, not states' rights, it's really states' powers. Then you get to Malcolm Fraser, New Federalism. By the time we get to John Howard's government and then Tony Abbott, the Conservatives are the centralists using that muscular power, the work choices case and so on, and Labor is sort of trying to defend and protect these things. So there is that question about how you integrate and what levels in which governance occurs. And Whitlam was obviously a centrist government.
Yeah, well, I mean, I really wanted to take a step back. The speakers so far have focused on the legislation that was passed during that historic joint sitting and the democratic advances that were made as a result of the passage of that legislation. But I wanted to reflect, I suppose, from a contemporary perspective on the events of 1974 themselves and the lasting legacy that they've had in transforming how we think about politics, how we think about the potential of the Parliament as a representative arena, and how we think about Australia's party system as well in the intervening period. So there are two sort of reflections that I want to make, and that the first I'm going to cast quite purposefully in positive terms, so it can perhaps entice a little bit of debate, and that is around the democratic possibilities of the Senate that were highlighted very, very so clearly in that period of intense contestation and disagreement. And then the second point I'm going to cast in more ambiguous terms, and that is around the democratic role and potential of double dissolution elections as mechanisms for resolving policy disputes. So I think, you know, with the lasting significance of the events 1974 and 1975, one of the most profound effects that I believe that they had was that they really did mark the point at which the party system began to significantly change in Australia, and that Australians' understanding of the Senate and its role, either as a House of Review or a States House or as something more, began to shift as well. Jenny, in her presentation this morning, highlighted just the sort of the scale of the levels of legislation that were rejected by the Senate, and the scale of the contestation that was occurring as being historically unprecedented. And I note that political scientists who have analysed that period, among them very, very notable international political scientist Aaron Leipart, who is known for developing that model that puts majoritarian-style democracies against consensus-style democracies, explicitly noted, and this was in a chapter that he wrote, Marian, for your edited book, Elections Full, Free and Fair, that period from the early 1970s onward marked the point at which Australia began to move away from a heavily majoritarian system of government to something that we can't call it consensus, but inherited and developed some of the styles of consensus-based politics. So casting, the net forward and understanding how a very intense period in time where there were very, very heated discussions, and discussions which still haven't been resolved, around the democratic potential and the legitimate role of the Senate in Australian democracy. Out of that contestation has emerged a House where, in combination with the electoral system that's used, we've seen parties such as the Australian Democrats emerge, the Green Party, to all of the minor parties and independents that characterise a more pluralist and multi-party chamber in today's democracy. So I want to sort of cast that as quite a unique shift and something that sort of highlights the democratic potential that can come out of a very significant period of contestation. The reflection that I want to make, which is a little bit more, as I said, ambiguous and less certain, is around double dissolution elections. So in 2016, the most recent of the double dissolution elections, I had the pleasure of editing the Australian elections volume, which reflected on that particular election. And the title, which I can't claim credit for, which has to go to Anthony Green, I think he was the one who suggested that, was Double Disillusion, not Double Dissolution. And I was really struck by that. And the reason why we did call it that is because the politics of cynicism, the politics of disengagement that surrounded both that overall election, but also the use of the double dissolution mechanism as a very politically expedient tool just to simply shift electoral timing and the timing of the electoral cycle, which I think it's interesting to sort of reflect back on the events of 1974 and the double dissolution elections since, that they have really been run on the usual economic lines. The debate has not focused on the policy issues that has spurred the need for the double dissolution in the first place. There's some really interesting, and I'll just very quickly mention this to contextualise the discussion and to really highlight the ambiguity that still is apparent when we think about double dissolutions and the role of the Senate, is figures from the Australian electoral study around split ticket voting. So that is where electors choose to cast a vote for one political party in the House of Representatives and another political party in the Senate. Back in 1987, split ticket voting stood at 17%. In 2016, it had risen to 35% of electors. So that indicates very, very strong support that to entertain the idea that there should be two different centres of power in the two different houses. Contrast that, though, with same electoral study, Australian electoral study, a question around should the government control the Senate? Now, this is very interesting. This ebbs and flows over time. But for the period between 1993 to about 2010, a majority of electors felt that it was better when the government does not control the Senate. Since 2010, that has flipped back over to a majority of respondents in that study indicating that it's preferable that the government controls the Senate. So that really, I think, does highlight that there is that continuing ambiguity, that there is a politics of disengagement, not quite understanding what those democratic roles are and the democratic potentials, but also that age-old argument about what is the appropriate and legitimate balance between the effectiveness of government and the democratic checks and balances that an upper house can provide. But the last point I'll make is that a lot of the discussion, and particularly referring back to that contestation in 1974, was very much about the government and the opposition, where we spoke in very clear political binaries. And that's certainly, given the composition of Australia's politics and party system today, we can't use those binaries anymore. So that adds yet another layer of complexity to the contemporary environment. Well,
let's pick up the Senate theme from your first part, and in many ways it sort of leads into the other discussion about the proper role of the Senate in a democratised Australia. But of course the other bills of the Senate the territory representation bills in the Senate, which for many people in the country people are unclear about the fact that the territories will be represented without constitutional change Indeed, at the last election, when I was advocating for doubling the number of senators for the ACT in the Northern Territory, many people said, but surely that needs constitutional change. There is not that great public awareness that Section 122 gives the Commonwealth the capacity to introduce more senators for the ACT in the Northern Territory, and the fact that we are 50 years on with still the same numerical representation, yet in the same period since 1975, when the ACT in the Northern Territory first received their representatives, the states have increased by 2. They've gone from 10 to 12 because of the 1983 change to increase the Senate representation from 10 to 12. Yet there was no equivalent change in the Northern Territory and the ACT. And it is a simple change to the Electoral Act and through the mechanisms of those bills that would very simply, and I'm emphasising the simple nature of it because it's simple political change as opposed to constitutional change that would require it. And it is interesting that it needed the joint sitting for it to come into force. And what we're seeing at the moment, post the last election, is the Labor government actually adopting as part of its national policy, following the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters report saying that the ACT in the Northern Territory should increase from 2 to 4. We've just seen recently the Labor Party saying they're not going to proceed unless they have bipartisan support from the opposition, which they're not guaranteed of getting, and so they're not going to be proceeding at the next election. I think it's an interesting reflection on where the territories sit, because if we come back to one vote, one value, if you live in Queanbeyan in New South Wales, 30 seconds across the road you're living in the ACT, the quality of your vote and your democratic representation is vastly different by virtue of the nature of our constitutional evolution, but could be easily changed. Now, some people would say, well, why not give the ACT in the Northern Territory 12 senators? I mean, Tasmania has an equivalent population with 12 senators. So the one vote, one value is totally distorted for Tasmanians by virtue of their guaranteed minimal representation, minimum number of seats in the House of Representatives, and of course their guaranteed 12 senators. So if we're looking at one vote, one value of the whole Parliament, as opposed to the House, then we all sitting in this room have different experiences if you're in the territories or if you're not in Tasmania. So I think there are sort of interesting questions to perhaps look at obstacles to democratisation and continuing changes. And I'm wondering if anyone's got any comments about those obstacles for democratic reform. Anyone in this around the table?
I'm happy to speak on that, but it'll be in a different direction.
Sure, absolutely.
Just thinking about the points I made earlier about legislation and the different ways of being governed. Of course, everyone is aware that the area of social security was fundamental in the Whitlam political program to the democratisation ambitions of that political program. And I'm very interested because in our memory of political epochs, we tend to, as we're doing today, rightly, we examine the politics of what was going on, the legislative agenda, but we often don't look to the translation of the political to the legislative to the administrative to find out what actually happened to people. And the research I've done around the 1974 situation is that there were several obstacles to greater inclusion, using the social security mechanism as a way of bringing more people into active citizenship, as you called it, Kim. There were several obstacles that they knew existed and were trying to address at the time. And one of the key ones is, of course, that like any administrative entitlements, there will be discretionary power. And there were concerns about how, despite the enfranchising political impulse behind so many of these legislative reforms, that actual decision-making would not take that up. And it was mentioned before by Nikki Saver, actually, about Bill Hayden's presence. And it's really striking when you go through the archival material to see the extent to which Hayden was such a hands-on minister in trying to ensure that the new powers that had been vested in the Australian government to invite people to take up these opportunities were exercised benevolently. Like, he gave directions to make it very clear that, you know, your Minister of Social Security wants you to make decisions that err in favour of the applicant and err in favour of the exercise of power in a constructive way. So that is something that is really, really interesting. Similarly, interesting work that was done at the time on implementation and monitoring of entitlements and how a lot of social conservatism remained, especially towards women and single women, despite the efforts to legislate this kind of program. But I wanted to bring everyone's attention to a wonderful 1974 piece that I read by Rundle Sackville, just thinking that he's been at this non-stop for over 50 years. It's on welfare and lawyers. And it's an absolutely brilliant analysis of how, despite the legislative ambush and this new range of entitlements that were so polity-creating and nation-building and doing so much to address the positions of otherwise marginalised people, what hadn't been properly thought through was who was going to assist those initiatives to actually work. And he does a wonderful analysis about how welfare is not traditional lawyers' territory, and that most lawyers did not understand the new mechanisms which they could help, and we're still battling with this in Australia, there was insufficient resources directed to legal aid, like understanding that we'd have to have new ways of supporting lawyers to interact with these democratising agendas. And we're still battling with that. Like, we have a Productivity Commission report that makes efficiency arguments for legal aid to support litigation in these sorts of areas. But we're still not quite having that one worked out, as in what that actually means for a larger inclusive polity, what role, if any, is to be played by lawyers, and what role of a government in supporting that. So these are real coalface takes on the issue of obstacles. But when you focus, as I try to do, on what actually happens, it's interesting how much the detail can undo some of the greater ambitions that we're seeing in these eras.
Can I just jump in very briefly to, I suppose there's a very sort of simple way of conceptualising the main obstacle to democratic reform. When we think about democratic reform in this context, the levers that we have are reform of our electoral laws, and that, you know, always happens at an absolute snail's pace. I think we'd probably not be exaggerating it, or often when there's a political scandal or a particular window of opportunity. But the simple reason is because, you know, essentially when we're changing electoral laws, we are changing the rules of the political game. Yeah. And thinking about an analogy, the people who are changing the laws for their own game are the players themselves. So would we entertain, you know, if they're going to change the rules of cricket, get the Australian and the New Zealand cricket team to sit down together and the players thrash it out? That's not going to work. Yeah. And so I think in this area there is much greater scope for the involvement of independent and expert bodies to assist with that decision making.
So I don't want to offend anyone here from Tasmania or the ACT, but I think it'd be swallowing a spider to catch the fly to have 12 senators from the northern... 12 senators from the Northern Territory. I sort of wonder about the talent pool. But there are other ways, obviously, and we need to find other ways to get people's input. And obviously the Indigenous voice was an interesting model for that we've passed up. And then part of the reason I think we passed up is because we have compulsory voting for referenda, which is wonderful for elections, but not so good if you're trying to get people to amend what's fairly dry, flinty legal text of a constitution, and people are rationally kind of ignorant of it, and that ignorance can be played on.
Maybe a theme from both of your responses is activating the citizens to be more aware of these issues so that they're forcing their politicians to be able to respond, because if the politicians are responding to the will of the people and we see swinging seats, exercising their power sometimes in greater ways by virtue of the politicians responding to ensuring that they return to power, if this became a significant issue to the voters, then in the fullest sense, representative democracy would be fulfilled. So perhaps there's a much broader role for independent bodies to be involved with educating the nation or engaging the nation in these issues because of the direct impact that this is having on everyone's life. on everyone's lives in the ways that Kristen's talking about in terms of direct welfare, but also in terms of the quality of representative democracy for all of us.
But I mean,
yes.
an increasing obstacle is really the shift in the shape of media. I mean, we heard this morning about the importance of newspapers in 1974. I mean, now news is gathered not from newspapers but from social media, and there's so much more scope for both misinformation and disinformation, which can be used so easily against the kind of positive electoral reforms and democratic reforms that we're talking about here.
Marian, I also just wanted to ask you to respond to some of Anika's statements about, or questions about the Senate and the changing nature of that in terms of sense of democracy and the role of women, because it was in the Senate that we started to see after 1975 and beyond the increase of women more so than the House of Reps, and what that says about the quality of representation for women.
Yes, well, as Anika said, I mean, we get a shift from majoritarian Westminster system, which we'd had with the increased presence of a diversity of political parties in the Senate, and which also helped more women into Parliament. Women have done better in minor parties in Australia, particularly those created after the arrival of the second wave of the women's movement. So we've had women coming in as political leaders in those parties first before they scaled the heights in the major parties. So, I mean, good things were happening because of the introduction of proportional representation in the Senate, involving both the representation of diversity of political opinion and the representation of diversity of well, what's the right word for it these days? Demographic characteristics is what I'm thinking of, but, you know, descriptive representation of the different elements of society, you know, is happening. So I don't think I have to say anything else. Of course, proportional representation ensured that the Senate became a proper House of Review, which had not before the introduction of proportional representation. So things are happening which make the Senate more important in democratic terms, I suppose. Yeah, I'll stop there.
All right, I'm conscious that there might be some questions from the floor, and I also want to come back to Graeme at the end, but Frank.
I want to ask about political parties. When I, see a phrase like democratisation of the Australian landscape, one of the first things I think of are political parties conforming to democratic norms. And, we've had battles in the Victorian Labor Party over something as basic as a secret ballot, which, we've had in the broader system since the 1850s. At the last election, we had a committee of, 3 who pre-selected, 9 candidates in the New South Wales Liberal Party. These don't look like ordinary sort of democratic practices to most Australians. And I know we've got several scholars of political parties here, so I wonder where they fit into the landscape that you've been talking about.
Oh, I'm the obvious one to kick that off, and I'm pausing for a little bit because I'm trying to think of a way of ingeniously connecting it back to 1974, where I suppose that teaches us that individuals have always got tricks up their sleeve. But in all seriousness, what you're speaking of, Frank, is a very legitimate and I think consequential problem. Not just for Australian democracy, but democracy worldwide, and that is respect and trust for political parties as key political institutions. And I say key because my scholarship has always argued that they are a part of the Australian landscape. They're not going anywhere, and they have really, really important democratic potential if they can engage and energise the population. But at this point in time, we have quite a critical juncture where parties could either take up that challenge, or we could see a reformulation of the political landscape once again, which arguably really has started happening already with the reformulation of political groups associated with independence, the community independent movement, for example, and a reconfiguration away from political party.
I mean, I suppose, you know, one of the issues is that when the registration of political parties came in 1984, it was not accompanied by any requirement for democratic processes within political parties. And indeed, you know, other strings also were lacking. I mean, it would have been very nice if when the Hawke government political party regulation was introduced, that benefiting from public funding of elections had been accompanied by a need to refrain from accepting private funding. I mean, that would have made a whole lot of difference to what's been happening in recent years if, that particular string had been attached to the introduction of public funding.
I was just going to add in response, Frank, to there's another question here about the interface between political parties and constitutional politics. Like what we saw with the joint sitting is how are they handling participating in an overt constitutional process, and how did we see this play out in the voice referendum? Like what is it that came to pass that made it possible for there to be a collective no stance on behalf of an entire political party in the referendum? And that, especially in circumstances where the mechanism there was no connection between the particular mechanism. It was not an election, it was a direct democratic mechanism, that there would be a political party framework or culture that would, at least on the face of things, bind everyone to the one position. Like, that is something, I think, the capacity for the maturity needed to work within constitutional politics as a particular form of politics was pretty grim in our most recent example of that. So just wanted to note that.
I should check to see if there are any more questions before I go to Graeme's final. Up the back, Malcolm McCarran.
May I ask you, Professor Rubenstein, a question?
Rubenstein, yes.
You will, of course, be very much aware that when the Territory Senate representation thing came in through the joint sitting we're talking about,
yes.
One of the things, the Liberal Party and the Country Party made every conceivable possible objection to it. And one of the things they said was that there's an illogicality about tying the Senate terms to the House of Representatives so that 2 come up every 3 years, compared with a fixed 6-year term for the Senate and the States. Now, on the question of Senate reform, now, I think the Senate electoral system is an absolute disgrace, it's a total disgrace, and it must be reformed. One of the reforms that I favour is what you want, which is to have 4 senators for the ACT, 4 senators of the Northern Territory, and then 14 senators for each of the states, which would produce a Senate of 92. Now, I'm in favour of that. But this is my question. Do you want to see 4 senators with the current tying to the House of Representatives, or would you prefer to see 2 senators come up each time with the same fixed 6-year term as the senators for the states? That's my question about what you're proposing, since you are proposing 4 senators for the ACT, with which I agree in general principle. But can I make the observation? The Australian Constitution requires that the Senate be unrepresentatives will. The Australian Constitution requires that the Senate be unrepresentatives will. It does. You can't get away from it. Now, the additional element of unrepresentatives will is this disgraceful system we have at the moment, with this dishonest ballot paper and this telling of lies to people about how you vote. Now, that's my hobby horse, but I'm just asking you, what are the details of your proposal?
So I think we can continue this discussion, Malcolm, outside, but for the benefit of everyone, there are two different objectives of increasing Senate representation. One is, of course, that in the ACT in particular, the major parties have had the certainty up until the last election of being guaranteed representation. The parties have been. And so to increase the likelihood of what happened at the last election, which is very rare, you need more than 2 people to be elected for the proportion of that you need to enter into Parliament to be reduced. So you need at least 3 or 4 for there to be a percentage that is doable for a smaller or a second member. So I would be, in moving to 4, I would say we should keep it at 3 each term. But David Pocock, the Senator for the ACT, has recommended 6 senators for 6-year terms and then only 3 at each election, which would achieve both objectives. So, yes, I think we should continue this because it is an interesting discussion. Your point about it being a federal body, a state's body as opposed to a representative body is an ongoing discussion about the proper balance between federalism and representative democracy. But on that note, and aware that we're going on to the next session, I did promise Graeme an opportunity to finish off with an anecdote for what I think everyone will agree has been a very stimulating discussion.
Can I just say, on parties, you look up there, you see it's not very diverse, but in one way it was more diverse because the major parties had social bases and had a much stronger socioeconomic representation. Mm-hmm. Frank, I mean, the opposite view would be simply as long as we have lots of different parties, which we certainly have now, as Marian said, and your vote is likely to count in the Senate, then does it matter how the sausage is made if there's lots of different sausages to choose from without getting into democracy sausages. Can I just, with indulgence, an anecdote. We talked about citizen awareness and so on. I was an annoying kind of school kid who finished his work early and then needed distraction. This is 1977. I'm in grade 7, and my teacher tells me, Graeme, there's something I think I want to show you in the storeroom. He wasn't that kind of teacher. He was a stalwart of the National Country Party in Nambour. At the end of our school veranda, in a very dusty storeroom, there were piles of Hansards, nearly as high as I was. They were blue for Queensland. They were like reading some kind of porn. I mean, Kev Hooper and Big Russ Hens. Red and green, and also the albino Hansard for the joint sitting, which I eventually found, and I've kept ever since, including I've covered up Nambour Primary School logos on it, so Education Department get me. But the point of the anecdote is not that the school librarians were hiding Hansards the way that school kids were like hiding their dreary Vegemite sandwiches but not throwing them away, making sure mum didn't find them. Rather, the point was when you look at the back of this, you could send in a postal money order for 5 cents and buy an individual copy of Hansard and have it posted to you in 1974. In 1975, it had increased by 1,500% to 90 cents. Was it inflation, Whitlam inflation? Was it government cost recovery? I'm not sure.
Could you please join me in thanking our panel for